Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book, the show comparison for the characters of the Expanse. So I recently did a series of videos that compared the Expanse TV series to the novels in which it was based, where I examined each episode of the show and compared the difference to the novels. In this video, I'll be looking at the characters of the show and analyzing how they compare to their counterparts in the novels. I'll be getting into some spoilers for the first 3 seasons of The Expanse, so if you haven't seen up to the end of Season 3, watch at your own risk. However, I will not spoil anything beyond Season 3 for those who haven't read the books. So, unlike in my book to show comparison series for the episodes, I will not be giving a score on how well I think the adaptation worked. I may give my opinion on the differences, but this video is less about making judgments on the changes and simply pointing them out. Also, in my previous video series, I explored the characters' specific storylines and how they compared to the novels, so that's not what I'll be focusing on in this video. Here I'll be looking more at the differences in appearance, personality, and generally how they are portrayed in the show as compared to the novels. So let's start with something I actually never mentioned in any of my previous videos, yet it tends to be one of the first things mentioned in any discussion that compares the show to the novels, and that's the difference in appearance of the Belters and the Martians in the novels. This is kind of touched on in the show, as Belters are sometimes referred to as skinnies, and they often try to cast tall and skinny actors in the role of Belters. However, in the novels, Belters were described as being tall and skinny to the point of being beyond what we'd consider a natural appearance for human beings in modern times. Belters are described as having large heads that seem disproportionate to their bodies in comparison to most human beings, and they are sometimes described as having comically large heads from an Earther's perspective. Belters are also described as being much taller than any human from Earth tend to be, average being 2.5 meters or 8 feet tall. And while the TV show does go out of its way to cast taller actors to play Belters, they still don't approach just how tall the Belters are in the novels. Thomas Jane, who plays Miller, for example, is a relatively tall guy, but still would come up way short and not nearly as skinny as Miller is described being in the novels. And Jared Harris, who plays Anderson Dawes, would probably look more like an Earther than a Belter by the novel standards. But there are a few examples of actors who more closely fit this description, such as the actress who played the prostitute that Havelock befriended in Season 1, or the Belter doctor who appeared briefly in Seasons 2 and 3, and sometimes they cast Belters that I don't think look like Belters at all. They're too short and too stocky. Now, as far as the Martians, they're kind of described in the novels as a middle, as an in-between Earthers and Belters, where they are taller and larger than most humans from Earth, but they're not quite as tall and skinny as Belters, so they tend to just appear as what in modern times would be described as tall people, and they have more mass than Belters would. However, the show just mostly seemed to cast normal-looking actors in the roles of Martians, although Cass Anvar, who plays Alex Kamal, and the actors who plays characters like Lopez and Korshunov are all about 6 feet tall, which is averagely tall for an Earther. It would probably be considered kind of short for a Martian. And some actors, of course, just look to be of normal build, such as the actor who played Captain Yao. In the novels, Bobby Draper is described as being particularly large, even for a Martian, and even though Frankie Adams, who plays Draper on the show, is quite tall, she usually dwarfs her castmates in cast photos, but still, she's not nearly as large as Draper is described being in the novels. Now, just to be clear, I'm not making a judgment call on the show for casting actors who may not be as tall as the novels describe Belters or Martians being, as I believe the show correctly is favoring acting ability and whether the actor feels right for the role over things such as height or weight, and I think that is very much the correct decision. Jared Harris, for example, may not look much like a Belter, but he really shines in the role of Anderson Dawes, and had they picked another actor who more closely resembled the build of a Belter, it may have severely dampened the quality of this character. Also, the way Belters are described in the novels typically cannot be naturally found in the appearance of present-day humans, so they would have to be enhanced by special effects, and I'm glad they didn't do this for several reasons. First off, it would be a costly waste of the special effects budget, and secondly, it would just make the Belters look strange to the point of being unbelievable, particularly to average modern-day audiences, and it would in fact be quite distracting. It makes sense from the perspective of the novels that most Earthers, particularly those who work in space, would be used to the appearance of Belters and not consider them so outrageous as it would be an accepted part of their modern day culture. But in our modern times, this appearance would look far too bizarre for the human mind to accept, and therefore it would be dismissed as silly or comical. However, the downside of the show not doing it is that it kind of decreases the difference between Earthers, Martians, and Belters, which is described a lot in the show, and sometimes one wonders how they can so easily differentiate between the three groups, whereas in the show they all look pretty similar, whereas in the novels it's beyond apparent just by looking at someone where they are from. But ultimately I'm okay with this, and I think the show definitely made the right call by not trying to duplicate this look. So now let me get into the specific characters, and let's start, of course, with the Rocinante crew, beginning, of course, with their captain, James Holden. Now, I don't recall any significant changes to his appearance, however, his character is quite different. In the novels, Holden has a bit of a hero complex to the point where the captain of the Canterbury has to keep reminding him not to be a hero, whereas in the show, he's seen as entirely unambitious. Of course, in the show, he was the second officer on the Canterbury, and he refused the position of first officer when McDowell tried to promote him to the XO. Whereas in the novels, he is the executive officer on the Canterbury already. And as the story goes on, Holden gains a reputation for constantly dumping sensitive information to the public when many feel he shouldn't. So he has this Ed Snowden type feel to him in the novels that his counterpart on the show never gained. The show did keep the story beat with him sending out a public message implicating the Martians were responsible for destroying the Canterbury, which caused the riots on Ceres, but other than that, the show didn't really keep up with the story beat. Whereas in the novels, Holden would constantly dump information on the public channels, and this earned him a reputation of being responsible for starting wars, as many in positions of power attribute him for being responsible for starting the Mars-Belter War with his message about the destruction of the Canterbury, and he was also blamed for raising the tensions between Earth and Mars, as after he released information implicating Earth in the construction of the stealth ships that destroyed the Dollinger, Earth preemptively responded to Mars by destroying one of its moons. In fact, this was a huge point of contention between Miller and Holden, as Miller totally blamed Holden for starting those wars, and they often had huge fights whenever Holden wanted to release more information to the public, where Miller would ask him if he's ever going to learn, but Holden took the position that by saying nothing, they just give impunity to those who thrive on operating in the shadows. This reputation carried on in future novels as well, as Alvis Sorella often described Holden as naive and not knowing what the fuck he was doing. And when Avasarala was on the Rosinante, the two of them clashed when Holden wanted to dump all the information on the conspiracy Aaron Wright and Admiral Wynne were involved in to acquire protomolecule technology and to start a wars with Mars, and he wanted to reveal all this sensitive information to the public. Holden was going to do it regardless of what Avasarala thought, but the Rosinante crew used their newly acquired voting power to override him, and instead they only sent the sensitive information to a few key allies Avasarala had in high positions, like Admiral Souther. However, in later novels he managed to temper these urges and was better at keeping key information closer to the chest. However, he still had a reputation of being overly open and honest to a fault, such as when the Martians detained Holden inside the ring during the Slow Zone incident in the third book. When Holden said he'll tell the captain everything he knows, she mentions that because this was Holden, she completely believed that statement. Whereas the show kind of steered clear of those traits, and I would say overall the show portrayed him a bit more of a novice or an everyman, where the books tend to portray him more as the stereotypical sci-fi space captain. The show's version felt more real, which I appreciate. So next, let's get to his exo, Naomi Nagata. As far as physical appearance, Naomi was described as being incredibly mixed in her ethnicity, resembling mostly someone of South American ancestry, but also mixed in with African and Asian features as well. Many described her as extremely exotic in appearance, as this particular blend of racial ethnicity was very rare. The actress they cast to play her is a mixed race, but mostly just having a Caucasian parent and a parent of African descent, so not nearly as exotic as Naomi was described being in the books. But then again, I understand this would be hard to find, and they put acting ability ahead of this, while still sticking with someone of mixed race. One noticeable difference, though, is Naomi in the novels is described as having long black curly hair that often gets in her eyes. In fact, Holden often muses that she sometimes hides behind this hair. Whereas in the show, Naomi's hair is always relatively short. As far as Naomi's personality traits, I would argue she wasn't nearly as developed of a character in the novels as she was in the show, particularly the first 4 books where she wasn't a viewpoint character. However, she was developed more in later novels when she did become a viewpoint character, and the show had the benefit of hindsight as it was being written during or after these later books had already been written. Therefore, it could incorporate some of these character traits and background information that wasn't revealed until later novels and earlier parts of the story. For example, it was mentioned in Season 1 that Naomi Nagata had a history with the OPA and used to be a member, but in the novels this wasn't mentioned until Book 5. Also in Season 2 and Season 3, Naomi mentioned that she had a son that was taken from her at a young age by the child's father, and this information again wasn't dropped until Book 5. Now, I have heard the opinion that revealing this information in earlier seasons spoils the reveal in Book 5 that was shocking to readers, but I humbly disagree and would argue this helps flesh out this character more in the earlier parts of the stories and gave her more dynamic, which I would argue her character wasn't as dynamic, particularly in the first 4 novels. Also, Naomi is portrayed as a bit more patriotic or loyal to the belt and the OPA in the show than she was in the books. As in the show, she would often get in arguments with Holden and other members of the Rosinante crew where she would defend the OPA or argue that they don't understand the situation in the belt because they're not from there, which didn't really occur in the novels at all. And of course, in the show, she secretly gave the protomolecule to the OPA against the wishes of her crewmates, which did not happen in the novels. And the biggest departure came in the later part of Season 3, where Naomi left the Rosinante in order to join the OPA as the chief engineer on board the Behemoth, and this did not happen at all in the novels, as she remained on the Rosinante the whole time. However, I see these changes as necessary for the show wanting to simplify and be more consistent for their cast of characters. So let's get into Amos next, who I think is quite different. First, in physical appearance, Amos is bald, and in many cases it's noted that he almost looks like a baby. A very large and muscular baby, though. In demeanor, Amos is also described as a killer with killer instinct, but is overall, I would say, less hostile. Particularly in Season 1, where Amos had almost a long-term feud with James Holden. At one time, Amos even said that he would have simply killed Holden without a second thought, and the only thing stopping him was that he knew Naomi would be unhappy about it. In fact, once during my book-to-show comparison series on the episodes, I noted that in the show, Amos's behavior was so aggressive towards Holden that if Book Amos was there, he would kick Show Amos's ass for being so disrespectful. Although this did change in later seasons as Amos gained more of a devotion to Holden that was more in line with his book's counterpart. However, in the novels, Amos was devoted to Holden from the beginning and often acted as his bodyguard, and from the get-go would refer to him as Cap. In the show, Amos is portrayed more as emotionally troubled, I would say, particularly in Season 2, when seeing a young child in distress caused him to become apathetic and uncaring to the point where he nearly killed Alex. Where Book Amos could have been just as distressed, but he would never outwardly show it, as he was always more guarded. Also, Book Amos's demeanor was described as a lot more cheerful and upbeat, particularly when he was threatening to kill someone, as it was often said he was most threatening when he had a cheerful smile. But both versions portrayed an indifference to killing and would use Holden as their moral compass. So next, let's get into Alex Kamal, and from the way he's described physically in the novels, I would say his book counterpart isn't nearly as attractive as Cass Anvar, who plays him in the show. I believe he's described as being older, balding, and if I recall in later novels, he was in fact bald, with a large pot belly one tends to develop in middle age. So the show version is a lot more youthful than his book counterpart. However, other than that, his personality traits are pretty similar in both versions, but his book counterpart is perhaps more upbeat and not as easily rattled as show Alex is. In the show, Alex is married with a son, and his wife later leaves him after he fails to inform her he survived the Canterbury's destruction for over a year. Whereas in the novels, he begins the story already divorced and with no children. However, in both versions, they make it clear that his love of flying was greater than the love of his spouse, which ultimately destroyed his marriage. So now let's get into some of the UN or Earth-based characters, starting with Christian Avasarala. In the novel, she's described as much older, smaller, and more fragile. She's often seen as an old grandmother who is dependent on a cane to walk. Believe it or not, she actually swears a lot more in the novels than she does in the show, and her behavior could be described as more volatile and more snippy than her show's counterpart, who tends to be more serious and demure. Although the kind of snippy relationship she had with Kotiar in Season 2 is similar to relationships she had with her assistant Soren in the second book. And of course, Avasarala wasn't in the first book at all, so they inserted her into Season 1. So since I mentioned Kotiar, let me just get to him next. Kotiar in the show was portrayed as a longtime acquaintance of Avasarala who was friends with her son who died during the war, and he felt responsible for her son's death, so felt a devotion to her. But they had a sort of antagonist relationship, and he was kind of a intelligence officer, so described as quite having a shady background, but he eventually teamed up with her to become her bodyguard, essentially. In the novels, Kotiar barely appeared. He only appeared in the sequence on board Jules Piraal's yacht, and he was simply a security officer assigned to her by the UN, so they had no close relationship. As I said, the nature of their snippy relationship was actually taken from the character of Soren, who was Avasarala's intern, her assistant, who eventually was fired for betraying her to Aaron Wright. So let me go ahead and talk about Sadavir Ehrenreich. And he was more of a supporting character in the novels who barely appeared. When he did, it was typically just as a face on the view screen that Avasarala was talking to via some form of communication or another. His presence was felt more in the novels than he actually appeared. So the show really elevated his character, and this was probably mostly due to them having to invent a storyline for Avasarala in season 1, as she needed people to react to and play off of. In the novels, Ehrenreich is described as a dark-skinned man of Middle Eastern ancestry, but someone who had a strong British accent. In fact, in the audiobook version of the novels, the voice actor reads his lines with a strong English accent. He wasn't portrayed nearly as villainous as the show's version, as he never killed a Martian ambassador, nor did he betray Avasarala after having promised to be on her side and willing to confess to his involvement in the proto-molecule conspiracy. However, the book's version did try to have Avasarala killed when he ordered the destruction of the Rosinante after she was already on board, but this didn't happen until much later in the story than it did in the show. And his story actually ended with him taking a deal that included early retirement, where he blamed everything on Admiral Wynn rather than getting arrested like he did in the show. Speaking of Admiral Wynn, let's get into him next, as in the show he's portrayed as a strong military hawk, war hawk you could say, who has an axe to grind against the Martians. But in the novels, he's more of a swarmy politician type, maneuvering to gain power. Avasarala often questioned the size of his manhood and would refer to him as a small man. When the protomolecule infected his ship, the Agatha King, instead of having an evil, maniacal laugh where he taunted Alex when he knew he was going to die, he actually whined and begged for his life and tried to use the failsafe key for the hybrid pods as a leverage to save his own life, which of course did not work. Speaking of Admiralty, there's also Admiral Souther, who in the novels I believe is implied to be Caucasian with gray hair. He's also the most prominent gay character in the first few novels, whereas in the show his sexual orientation is never stated. The show kind of gave the trait, this particular trait, to Ambassador Tamars de Graaf, who was shown to be in a same-sex marriage. This character, however, was not in the novels and was an invention of the show. Also, the show portrays Souther as having a rocky relationship with Avasarala, where he groups her together with Aaron Wright as being the worst kind of person in the world. He also is shown to have very high morals, and such high morals that he resigns as fleet commander rather than order an attack on Mars. However, in the novels that's not the case, as he was never the fleet commander for the whole UNN, but he does command his own fleet, and he is allied with Avasarala in her quest to expose the conspiracy involving Aaron Wright. He is never the commander of the Agatha King, as he was in the show. Instead, he commanded a ship called the Akimbo. So he wasn't with Admiral Wynn on the Agatha King during the incident at Io. Instead, he commanded his own fleet of UN ships from the Akimbo, which threatened Wynn's fleet. However, Souther was allied with a Martian fleet and the Rosinante as well, meaning their forces greatly outnumbered Wynn's forces, yet Wynn still refused to back down. And unlike in the show, Souther survived this incident and lived a much longer life. So now let's talk about Julius Piraal. In the novels, Mal is described more as European in appearance rather than Asian, I believe. He has blue eyes and a receding hairline that he refuses to modify, even though he's certainly wealthy enough to do so. Avasarala noted that it gave him a really dignified look, and she described him as incredibly handsome. Mal did not appear in the novels nearly as much as he did in the show, and again was more of a background guy. He never went to Io to work with Dr. Strickland and never had a violent encounter with Avasarala on his yacht. Instead, he just taunted her on the yacht and behaved in a very arrogant manner. He was arrested after the Io incident, in which Holden was present when Avasarala informed him that his empire was crushed and that he would never see the outside of a prison cell for the rest of his life. So next, let's get into UN Secretary General Esteban Sorrento Gillis, who also appeared in the novels a lot less than he did in the show. The novels described his appearance as outwardly Hispanic, and his demeanor was a lot less imposing. In Avasarala's opinion, he was incredibly unqualified for the job, and he only got it due his celebrity status as having survived as a political prisoner for several years. Both the book and the show portray him as someone who is led by his underlings rather than leading himself. In the novels, Avasarala refers to him as the bobblehead. The show gave a nod to this in one line of dialogue where Avasarala called him a bobblehead. However, his book counterpart wasn't as concerned about his legacy, and he never used Anna to ensure his legacy would endure, as the book version of Gillis was not portrayed as nearly as clever, and ultimately he didn't have any agency of his own. And then there's Anna Velovadov, who in the novels didn't appear until the third book, therefore she wasn't present at UN headquarters during the end of the Earth-Mars conflict like she was in the show. Further, she was not acquainted with the UN Secretary General Sorrento Gillis as she was in the show, and she never worked as a speechwriter. She also did not own and operate a clinic on Earth that helped undocumented. When we first meet Pastor Anna, she's running a church on the Jovian moon of Europa, where she tasers an abusive husband of one of her flock members and has him arrested. She is much more humble of background and is not very well known publicly before the Slow Zone incident like she is in the show. In the novel, she's described as being shorter and smaller than she appears in the show, and she has red hair. In fact, when Amos meets her, he calls her Red as a nickname. The performer who reads the audiobook reads her lines with a thick Russian accent. However, in the novel, she's also married to a Ugandan woman named Nono, and together they have a daughter named Nami. However, at the start of the third book, they're living with her on Europa, but when Anna leaves to go to the ring, Nono takes Nami back to Earth to live in Russia, where Anna joins them after she returns from the ring. While on the Thomas Prince, Anna mostly interacts with two people, Tilly Fagan and Hector Cortez, also known as Father Hank. Both of these characters also appear in the show, but their roles are severely reduced. Tilly Fagan was much older in the novels than she appears in the show, but she has the same basic demeanor. She is said to be friends with the Mal family and knew Clarissa and Julie when they were little children. In the novel, she's acquired her vast fortune through her husband, unlike the show where she acquired her fortune through her parents. Also in the novels, Tilly survives the Slow Zone incident and returns safely to Earth, unlike in the show where she dies. In the novel, she repays Anna a favor by buying the Rosinante from the Martians and gifting it to James Holden. Hector Cortez, or Father Hank, has a much bigger role in the novels, as he doesn't leave the Thomas Prince before it enters the ring. In fact, he teams up with Captain Ashford in his mutiny to retake the Behemoth in an attempt to use its comm laser to destroy the ring. He also befriends Clarissa Mal and convinces her to join Ashford's side. He was the one who was said to be friends with Secretary General Gillis, a trait that the show gave to Anna instead. He was seen as a very well-known and prominent religious figure on Earth, something that the show did kind of hint at. Speaking of Clarissa Mal, let's get into her next. In the novel, she took the alias of Melba Coe, just like she did in the show. However, the novels made it clear from the beginning that she was Julie Mal's sister, Clarissa. In the novel, she's described as being much smaller and skinnier and is often described as very fragile looking, which makes her appearance extremely deceptive considering her combat enhancements. After taking sides with Captain Ashford during the mutiny on the Behemoth, Pastor Anna convinces her to let Holden and his strike team into the command center where a battle ensues. And despite Hector Cortez's attempt to convince her otherwise, she eventually turns on Ashford, striking him down and shutting off the systems that convince the ring space that they aren't a threat. Pastor Anna convinces Holden to transport Clarissa Mal back to Earth by having her friend Tilly buy the Rocinante and give it back to Holden. She's worried if a UN ship transported Clarissa, she would mysteriously end up dead. During the voyage back to Earth, Clarissa is given free reign of the ship, where she helps in repairs and makes friends with Amos, who nicknames her Peaches. Okay, so now let me get into some of the Martians, starting with everyone's favorite Martian, Bobby Draper. As I touched on earlier, in the novels, Draper is described as incredibly large, even for a Martian. Most people, when they first meet her, refer to her as a giant. However, I have heard some people complain that the actress they cast for her is too attractive. However, this also is in line with the novels that described her as not only physically intimidating, but also very attractive. In fact, the novels play off of the fact that Holden can't help but be a little giddy around her because he instinctively finds her very attractive, but he tries to ignore that instinct, but Draper can tell, and Holden suspects she mocks him because of this. Her demeanor and storyline in the books is very similar to how it plays out in this show, except in the novels she doesn't attack her superior and run to the UN embassy to defect. Instead, she is simply hired by Avasarala openly, and the Martians allow this, but then quietly outcast her for it. Also, she doesn't appear in the third novel at all, so therefore she isn't present for the incident in the ring as she was in the show. So Lieutenant Lopez is a character that appeared in the first season episodes Remember the Cant and CQB. He served on the Dollinger, where he interrogated Holden, but eventually helped rescue Holden and the Canterbury survivors, escorting them to the ship that would eventually become the Rocinante, where he died once they were on board. This character is actually an amalgamation of two characters from the novels, Lopez and Lieutenant Kelly. Lopez was an intelligent officer who interrogated Holden, and Lieutenant Kelly was a Martian Marine who led the team that escorted the Rocinante crew off the ship. This character was less adversarial than Lopez was portrayed in the show, as Holden didn't need to convince him to save the rest of his people, but he also gave his life saving the Canterbury survivors. Another example of the show combining Martian characters from the novels can be found in Season 2, while Bobby Draper is interrogated by an intelligence officer named Thorson and then taken to Earth by a chaplain named Captain Martins, who claims to be a friend of Draper's father. In the novels, these two characters also exist. However, it is Thorson who takes Draper to Earth and oversees her time during the peace conference, and not Martins. In the novels, Martins serves more as her counselor, who genuinely is concerned for her well-being and not just using her as the show version of Martins is. So Draper and Martins actually part on very good terms, where Draper thanks him for all his help. The character of Korshunov, who leads the negotiations with the UN in Season 2 and is revealed to be secretly working with Julius Piraal on the protomolecule hybrid project, is a pure invention of the show, and therefore there's no equivalent to this character in the novels. So let's move on to the Belters, and let's start with everyone's favorite Belter, Detective Miller. This character is very similar in appearance and demeanor to his novel counterpart, and his storyline more or less is the same. Some key differences is in the novels he had went through a rough divorce that he was still recovering from, whereas in the show they implied he had a prior relationship with Detective Muss, whereas in the novels Muss was simply the new partner that he was assigned to after Havelock left series. Also in the show, he seemed to be aware that everyone viewed him as a washed-up detective who was corrupt and worthless, whereas in the novels he was totally oblivious to this perception of him, and this came as a shock to him when Muss revealed this to him, that no one wanted to be his partner, which is why he was assigned an Earther as a partner, and she was assigned to be his partner as punishment for rejecting the sexual advances of a superior. So next, let's talk about Fred Johnson, who is in the strictest sense isn't a belter, but he is the proud leader of the OPA. In physical appearance, he's pretty much described exactly as how he looks in the show, so one might call it perfect casting. His demeanor, however, is somewhat different, as he's much more antagonistic in the show than he was in the novels. For example, he never threatened to take the Rosinante by force in the books like he did in the show. In both the books and the show, he's known as the Butcher of Anderson Station. However, the novel's version of this involves him leading a UN strike team to violently retake Anderson Station, which had been taken by armed protesters, in a long, drawn-out battle that saw almost all the Belter protesters killed, while suffering very little casualties on his side, as opposed to the show's version that showed him destroying a station filled with unarmed men, women, and children who were simply protesting not having enough air to live. Also in the novels, Johnson's sect of the OPA is portrayed as less as a terrorist group and more of a legitimate political organization. His leadership of the OPA is also portrayed as more absolute and less challenged in the novels than it is in the show, where he is vying over leadership with Dawes. In the novels, for the most part, his challengers have too small of a followings to be a serious threat to him. Speaking of Dawes, the character who appears in the show named Anderson Dawes is almost an entirely different character than the one that appears in the novels named Anderson Dawes. In the novels, Dawes is described as unimposing, a pox-faced man. He's described more as a politician who maneuvers political situations to his favor, rather than the power-hungry terrorist that he's portrayed to be in the show. And in the novels, rather than being Fred Johnson's adversary, he's actually Johnson's friend and mentor. Although the show did keep the character beat of Dawes being the one who recruited Johnson into the OPA, however, unlike the novels, in the show, Johnson and Dawes had since had a falling out when Dawes perceived Johnson as a threat to his power in the OPA. Whereas in the novels, Dawes more of used Johnson's position of power in the OPA to benefit himself. Also, Dawes never threatened to kill Detective Miller. Instead, he politely warned him to back off of the Julie Mao case, and when Miller refused to do so, he simply used his influence to get him fired. Dawes also never stole Kotazar from Johnson in the novels, as Kotazar wasn't even a factor in this part of the story in the novels, as he didn't appear into a short story that was later released sometime around the time of Book 5 that retroactively took place around the time of the first and second novel, and it featured none of the main characters. So now let's talk about Johnson's right-hand man or woman, Mina Drummer. The character of Drummer doesn't appear in the novels until Book 5, and since her storyline mostly involves what would be considered spoilers for the show beyond Season 3, I won't get into any details here. Suffice to say, the show version of Drummer is an amalgamation of several book characters who were cut from the show, particularly Sam, Michio Pa, and Carlos Baca, otherwise known as Bull. Sam was an engineer working for Fred Johnson on Tycho Station, who often led the repairs on the Rosinante, who was a close friend with Naomi Nagata. The show incorporated those aspects into Drummer. In the show, Drummer served as Johnson's second in command, where I believe in her first appearance in Book 5, she was Johnson's chief of security. And there were several minor characters throughout the first few books that served as Johnson's assistant or second that aren't really worth mentioning, and that Drummer fulfills their roles in Season 2. In Season 3, however, she took over for characters like Michio Pa and Bull, who were on the Behemoth. Bull was Johnson's friend sent on the Behemoth to keep an eye on things for him, and Michio Pa was the Behemoth's young first officer, seen by many to be too young to hold a position that high. So it seems those aspects were rolled into Drummer, as well as aspects of Sam serving as Naomi's friend on board the Behemoth. Book Drummer honestly wasn't given much personality until Book 7, where she was a viewpoint character, where she was in fact very similar in demeanor to Show Drummer. However, since Book 7 was written after Season 2 was made and around the same time Season 3 was being made, it does make one wonder if the show's version of her had influenced the authors on how they wrote her in Book 7, although they would strongly deny their involvement of the show having any influence on how they wrote the books. I still question that myself. So speaking of the Behemoth, let's get into Ashford. In the show, Ashford is portrayed as an old pirate who's done a lot of, let's say, morally questionable things in his life. Ashford is associated with Dawes' faction of the OPA and is sent to the Behemoth as Dawes' representative there, where he serves as first officer. He's seen as having superior experience and ability to the captain of the Behemoth, Drummer, but for political reasons he serves as a Drummer's executive officer instead. So like Dawes, the book version of Ashford is almost an entirely different character. As I mentioned, the split between Dawes and Johnson's factions over control of the OPA did not exist in the novels, and Johnson had full control over who staffed the Behemoth. His friend Carlos Baca, or Bull, had the most experience and ability to captain the Behemoth, but he was an Earther, and because Johnson was also from Earth, it would be seen as Earthers trying to control the belt by having two Earthers being the highest positions of the OPA. So for political reasons, Ashford was made captain of the Behemoth. Bull was originally meant to serve as his executive officer, however, for further political reasons, shortly before the Behemoth embarked on its mission to the ring, Bull was further demoted to second officer, and the young Michio Pa was brought in to serve as the executive officer because, like Ashford, she had the virtue of being from the belt. In the novels, Captain Ashford was shown as a politically motivated creature who was more concerned about his own image and relied more on vanity than experience. Bull considered him incredibly unqualified to captain the ship, something that Ashford could tell, which created a rift between them, which eventually resulted in an all-out civil war when the two factions fought over control of the Behemoth during the Slow Zone incident. During which time, Pa, who initially also didn't care for Bull, ended up siding with him because she could see that he was right about Ashford, that he was unqualified to serve as the captain. Pa had initially served as the Behemoth's captain when Ashford was relieved of duty, but when she was injured during the violent mutiny when Ashford reclaimed the ship, she had to remain in hiding, leaving Bull to lead the charge against Ashford. So as you can see, certain aspects of Bull were given to the show version of Ashford, such as superior experience and having to deal with a younger, less experienced captain, and other traits of show Ashford were just created by the show. And while Ashford ended up serving the same story purpose of trying to destroy the ring and opposing Holden, who wanted instead to shut down all the ship's power, he is almost an entirely different character than he was in the books. In fact, trailers for Season 4 show that Ashford will be involved in the story going forward, whereas in the novels it's implied after the Slow Zone incident, Ashford was thrown in a deep, dark cell and never saw the light of day ever again, so to speak. I mean, they're belters, they never really see the light, but you know what I mean. So I guess I should just touch briefly on Diago, the young whippersnapper first shown stealing water on Ceres and then was thrown out into space by his uncle until eventually meeting up with Miller once again on an OPA mission to take Throth Station. Afterward, he let Miller bunk with him after the detective was kicked off of the Rocinante, and then he accompanied Miller to his mission to crash the Nauvoo into Eros. Later, Diago betrayed Johnson to Dawes, helping Dawes steal Kotazar, and he returned to the story later in Season 3 on the Behemoth, where he served as Ashford's personal henchman. In the novels, this character first appeared on Throth Station, where Miller was looking after him during that little incursion. He did let Miller bunk with him after he was kicked off the Rocinante, and then he went with Miller to Eros, where the two parted ways after Miller elected to stay behind to die on Eros. But that was the end of his story, and that was all of Diago's involvement. He wasn't seen after that. He never served on the Behemoth, nor was he ever stealing water on Ceres. So in other words, he wasn't nearly the little shit that he was in the show. So next, let's get into Prax, who I guess doesn't have much difference in physical appearance in the novels. However, he is described as extremely malnourished and a lot more sort of skinny and to the point of starvation when Holden first meets him. So a lot more unhealthy looking than he did in the show. And his demeanor is described as much more meek, I would say. Like, he's pretty buff in the show, whereas in the book he's more of like the scientist type, and plus in his demeanor he's a lot more concerned with the science, and sometimes he goes off on rants about the science involved in the protomolecule, not really thinking the implications of what it might mean for his daughter, whereas in the show he's chiefly concerned with his daughter and doesn't go off on as many scientific tangents. In fact, I kind of noted that in the books, each book tends to have a scientist character, and they're all actually pretty similar, to be perfectly honest. They all are obsessed with the science, and they go off on all these scientific rants, and so Prax kind of fit that stereotype that each book seems to have a character like that, whereas in the show he wasn't like that at all, and he was actually a bit more standalone. Anyway, that's all I have for my book to show comparison for the characters. However, if you did find this video interesting, I would recommend checking out the series of book to show comparison videos I did for every episode of the first 3 seasons of The Expanse, and I will return in Season 4 to cover all the episodes of Season 4 with a review and a book to show comparison video. So be sure to check out my channel for that, as well as I do many more videos on other shows like Star Trek, Lost, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that. And thanks a lot for watching.